This series of lectures, 3 lectures, tonight and next Tuesday night, and then the following Monday night, deal with customs of Ashkenazic Jewry. And since customs are very important, people attach a great deal to customs. So sometimes we have to know the origin of the customs, and sometimes we have to know whether even the customs are valid. My purpose here is not to change anyone's custom, and certainly not to change the customs in our synagogue or any other synagogue. But there are fascinating things that are involved here. And in understanding those things, we will understand a broader range of topics in Jewish life than just the specific customs that are involved. So tonight, I'm going to speak about customs of prayer, the customs within the tefillah according to the custom of Ashkenaz. And I'm going to speak about 4 different customs which have become widespread and prevalent, and all 4 are subject to some sort of controversy, because otherwise they wouldn't be Jewish customs. The first topic has to do with the recitation on Shabbat and Yom Tov of Brich Shmei, after they take the Torah out of the ark. So we say, at the beginning we say, Vayhi ben Soah Ha'aron, which is a verse from the Torah. And then they added a verse from the Novi, Ki mitzion teitzei Torah dvar Hashem Yerushalayim. And then there is a phrase in praise of God that he gave the Torah to the Jewish people. Baruch shenasan Torah le'amo Yisrael b'kedushaso. End. In all of the original Machzorim of the Ashkenazim, dating back to the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries, the Chazan then immediately proceeds to say Shema Yisrael and to bring the Torah down. Now what happened was, in the 1400s, a Jew by the name of Moses de Leon in Spain claimed that he found an ancient manuscript which he called the Zohar, and he copied that manuscript and he published it and disseminated it. Now the Zohar, he attributed it to Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, the great Tana, the student of Rabbi Akiva, the one to whose grave at Meron every year on Lag BaOmer hundreds of thousands of Jews visit. Since the Zohar did not reach an audience, a public audience, until the 1400s, so it's obvious that in the 11th century, 12th century, 13th century would not appear in the customs of Ashkenaz, because no one had the book. Because Brich Shmei is a piece of the Zohar taken from Parshat Vayakhel. And in it, the Zohar says, this is an appropriate prayer to say when the Torah is taken out of the ark. Now, so there are a number of ways to look at this. The first way to look at it is regarding the Zohar itself. Who wrote it? Is it accurate? Now, in our time, the Zohar is accepted almost universally as being a holy book. In fact, it's called the Zohar HaKadosh, the Holy Zohar. Amongst the Sfardim, it's very, very popular. In fact, entire sections of the Zohar are committed to memory and are recited. There are many that recite the whole part of the Zohar concerning the Parshat HaShavua, the Thursday night before Shabbat. All of that makes it acceptable. Amongst the Ashkenazim, so you have the, in the Hasidic world, the Zohar is also sacrosanct. It's accepted, and much of Hasidus, the ideas of Hasidus are based upon statements in the Zohar. However, and there is a big however, there's another opinion. The other opinion is that Brit Shemay should not be recited. And underlying this is the question of the Zohar. Rabbi Yaakov Emden, the great scholar in the 1700s in Hamburg, and he owned a printing press. He produced many, many great works. A very, very controversial figure. He was engaged all of his life in trying to straighten out the world. And the world always pushed back. He writes, Kemat ein li sofek bedover. I have no doubt regarding the Zohar that it's not authentic. Gam yesh leida sheichnisu besocho dvorim harbe. They introduced into the Zohar many things that even if Reb Shimon ben Yochai had such a sefer, the sefer that we have is not that sefer. Rak hagos acharonim od. Later people, everybody added to it. The printers added to it. The copyists added to it. Ve'hem robu kamo robu, and it became more and more and more. V'uchal la'achriach u'lo'chiach ze b'siyata d'shmaya. I can prove it to you, he says. Ve'ashma samatikim hi. It is the fault of the copyists and the printers. And therefore I wrote a book about it called Mitpachas Sfarim. In his book, Mitpachas Sfarim, which is devoted to this topic. So he says, there are ideas of Reb Shimon ben Yochai in the Zohar, but the Zohar itself is not from Reb Shimon ben Yochai in the way that we have it. And therefore, it's, so to speak, not really authentic. He's not alone in this. Others also claimed that the Zohar was not what we claim it to be. The great defender of the Zohar was the Chidah, Reb Chaim Yosef David Hazulai, also in the 1700s, who practically accused Reb Yaakov Emden of heresy in stating that the Zohar is not authentic. And he says everybody uses it, and all the great rabbis, and the whole Kabbalah is based on it. How could you say it's not? However, the Chassam Sofer, Moshe Sofer, rose in defense of Yaakov Emden in the 1800s. And he said, Hine nimtza sefer mitpachas svorim l'Rab Yaakov ben Tzvi Emden. We have this book, Mitpach HaSforim, to Rabbi Yaakov Emden, Timtza Shom Kidover Godel Diber Anovi. What he says is true, it's prophecy. And therefore he said, the Chassam Sofer said, Ilu hoyo yecholes biad odom lahamid midroshe Reb Shimon ben Yochai al taroson. If we could sift the book and keep only the words and ideas of Reb Shimon ben Yochai that appear there, levari mehem ma shenischaber aleim mechachmei ador she'acharov, to be able to clear out what later people wrote about it, lo yiyeh kulo rak sefer koten akamus mod. Be a very, very thin book, he said. The Zohar is a very big book. Very thin book. Machzik dapim muotim. Would have only a few pages. Chassam Sofer. The Talmud of the Noda B'Yehuda of Rabbi Yechezkel Halevi Landau, Rabbi Elazar Falaknish, so he wrote a Sefer Tshuva Me'ava, very famous Sefer. And he says, he says it most strongly of all, Hareini nishba b'Torah Hashem. I swear by God, by the Torah, sheSefer HaZohar nimtza kamo ziyufim. It's a forgery. V'kilkulim asher osifu. And all sorts of things that were added. Ve'ole echad miTalmud Bavli, one page of the Talmud Bavli, kodosh yoser mikol Sefer HaZohar, is more holy than the whole book of the Zohar. Lav migush b'nei Reb Shimon ben Yochai zaktiya. It never came from Reb Shimon ben Yochai. And Misha Yeshlo Chatzi Das Yoid Kain, someone who has a little seichel will understand that that can't be from Reb Shimon ben Yochai. Sharei Niskru b'Sefer HaZohar kama Tanoim v'Amoroim shoyu achar Reb Shimon ben Yochai. Because people are listed there who lived way after the time of Reb Shimon ben Yochai. And then he says there are entire pieces of Rashi that are in there, and pieces of Tosfos that are in there. So he says the whole thing was put together. There's an interesting point that has to be said also. But the wife of Moshe de Leon said that he wrote it. So it's always good to have a wife that supports you and is on your side. So from the beginning there is an aura of problems here. So because of the underlying problem with the book of the Zohar, so many Kehilos and Ashkenaz, especially in Germany, never said Brich Shmei, because it's a piece of the Zohar. However, in Eastern Europe, where the Hasidic community was very strong, so by the middle of the 18th century, it was printed in all the Sidurim, and it became to be recited. The rabbis raised three objections to Brich Shmei, even if we say that the Zohar is authentic. And I'm not going to stick my neck out on this question, because greater people than I have disagreed on it. They said there are three problems with it. First of all, the rabbis, and this is again something that changed with Hasidus, the rabbis always tried to keep Kabbalah secret. And they tried to keep the Zohar secret. And in fact, that's what they said. That's why we didn't find the Zohar until the 1400s, is because of the fact that we never allowed it to be publicized. And then he came along and publicized it. He let the genie out of the bottle. So we don't want to say pieces of the Zohar publicly. A second problem has to do with words that appear in the Zohar. In the Zohar, in Brich Shmei, it says, Lo al enosh rachitzna, we do not depend upon human beings. Velo al bar Elohim somichna. The literal translation of bar Elohim, literally, is son of God. Well, we don't want to say that. And therefore, most of the defenders said that Bar Elohim means angels. And there's a question, the phrase appears in Daniel. So in Daniel, the Christians use it as a proof in the Bible. And the rabbis always said that it means angels. There's no such thing. It's a blasphemy to say that a human being is the Son of God. In our time, in the 1950s, the Rabbinical Council of America, in pre-Art Scroll days, commissioned an English translation of the Siddur. It's published by Berman House. It was a black Siddur, was distributed in many, many Orthodox congregations throughout the United States. And the translation was by Rabbi Dr. David DeSolo Poole, who was the chief rabbi of the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue in New York. He translated it, Son of God. Well, the roof fell in. And because of that, the publisher had to recall the translation, and they republished with all the problems involved, and they said angel. And if you look in the Art Scroll translation, it also says angel. But it says Bar Elohim. Those are the words that appear. So the rabbi said, why should we get involved in this matter completely? We won't say it. Nowhere there, it's a relatively new custom. So why should we say it? Let's not say it. There was a third reason that they opposed it. In Brich Shmei, we ask that the Rabboni Shalom should help us, that he should fulfill our wishes, etc., etc. We have a rule that on Shabbat and Yom Tov we don't request personal favors, so to speak. In the middle of the week, we do. But Shabbos and Yom Tov, we don't ask God for anything. You'll think about it, it's an exalted idea. Because on Shabbos and Yom Tov, you don't need anything. And in Brich Shmei, we ask him for things. And since the custom was to say it only on Shabbos, so we shouldn't say it. So the answer to that became that they transferred and said Brich Shmei during the middle of the week too, which is the custom that exists today, Monday and Thursday. Shabbos for Mincha, whatever, we always say it. The Chafetz Chaim, in his inimitable fashion, says, I don't know that we should say it because it says, Ana avdo dekutsha brichu. I am a servant of God. He said, who can say that I'm a servant of God? Where does a person take upon himself to say that he has reached the level that he can be a servant of God? Moshe was Eved Hashem. The Ovos were Eved. But that we should say, Ano Avda Rekutsha Brichu, looks a little exaggerated. So he doesn't say not to say it, but he just adds that piece of musar, that piece of ethics, and therefore this also became part of the reason people didn't say it. However, the custom is spread, and it's said by everyone. Part of the problem is it's written in Aramaic. So they said, well, if it's written in Aramaic, nobody knows what they're saying. So that's a plus and a minus. Because then nobody worries about the Bar Elohim or Anohavdo, you know. But it's a minus because, well, you know, you're supposed to know what you're saying. And I noticed that in the Rinas Yisrael Sidurim, he translated it into Hebrew, which also leaves some people not knowing what they're saying. Then later, in our time, it was put to music. People sing it at the Chazan sings at Be'an Orochitz. So it became ingrained within us, that custom, and that's the custom. However, there are pockets of resistance that still exist in the synagogues that follow the strict Nusach Ashkenaz, or Nusach Frankfurt, the Redelheim, those communities, they don't say it. They don't say it, for whatever the reasons are that have been outlined here. But again, because the Hasidic movement had such a powerful influence and continues to have probably the strongest influence on how Orthodoxy looks today, so it's an accepted minhag to say it. And if it's said in the synagogue, the wise rabbi will not attempt to change the custom. Which brings us to another custom. Wearing a talit when one prays, one leads the prayer, when one is the chazan. So there are two items here. One item is wearing a talit is because of the mitzvah of tzitzit. So therefore, people wear a talit. But there's a second item called kovod hatzibur. Kovod hatzibur means in honor of the community, of the audience, so to speak. And that therefore we don't want people to appear so to speak, informally as leading the service, because that can be interpreted as denigrating the honor of the community. And therefore, a chazan, the leader of the service, should always wear a talit. And then the question is, how about mincha? And then how about ma'ariv? Because then in Mariv, there's no mitzvah of tzitzit anymore at all. So, for instance, we find the ancient Ashkenazic custom, apparently from Bovel yet, was they would say slichot at night, let's say like we say Saturday night. But the chazan, so that's not a time of tzitzit at all. But all of the poskim say that the chazan should wear a talit. Those that say that you don't have to, so therefore it's a proof that even for tfilat arvit, even for the Ma'ariv service, you should have to wear a talit, because we see that for slichot, which is also in the middle of the night, the chazan has to wear a talit. To which the retort of those who don't wear a talit is, the reason that we wear a talit for slichot is because we say the 13 attributes of God. Hashem, Hashem, Kelachum, V'chanun. And that's based on the Medrash. The Medrash says that Kaviochel, God wrapped himself in a talit like a shliach tzibur when he passed over Moshe and told him the Yud Gimel Midot. So whenever you say the Yud Gimel Midot, you should wear a talit. But that it's not a proof, so to speak, that at night you have to wear a talit. So there arises from that all sorts of other things. For instance, here in Israel, formal dress is many times absent. I'm now always reminded that Theodor Herzl, in one of his wild dreams, described what the Jewish parliament would look like in the Jewish state. So he said in the Jewish parliament, everybody would wear tails, and a formal dress, top hat, would look like 1890 Vienna. And I was struck by that once when I was in the visitors gallery at the Knesset, and the only ornament, so to speak, in the room is the picture of Herzl in back of the speaker, and one of the guys got up in his pajamas and sandals, to deliver one of his speeches, and the Herzl is looking over his shoulder, right? And so the concept of formal dress here, unfortunately or fortunately, I don't judge that either, is absent. But there apparently is a concept in tefillah that the chazan that leads the tefillah should somehow have some sort of formal dress. So in Lithuania, for instance, the custom was that you had to wear a jacket, not to daven in one's shirt sleeves, even long shirt sleeves. In the yeshivas, even today, everybody davens with a jacket. And everybody davens with a hat as well, because of the fact that that's the formal dress, which lends some sort of gravity to the prayer service, hopefully. There's another idea in the Torah, it's in the Tanakh, it says, Hikon likras Elokecho Yisrael. Prepare yourself to meet your God, O Israel. So the Gemara points out that in the time of the Gemara, therefore, and that's the origin of having a gartel. There are two reasons for a gartel. But so one reason is to divide the upper body from the lower body. So Tosfos says there that we don't need to wear a gartel because we wear trousers. And at the time of the Talmud, they wore long cloaks, and therefore they had to put the belt on. But we who wear a belt or have our pants separate, so that's not necessary. But Hikon likras Elokecho Yisrael, that reason still remains. So therefore, for instance, in the yeshivas, you have to button your jacket before you stand Shemona Esrei. In our time, you have to, if you're wearing a talit, you have to put the talit over the head. You have to do something before Shemona Esrei to indicate that you're coming to speak to God. There has to be some sort of formality. So that was the idea of the of wearing a talit. And in Germany, where most of the Mנהג Ashkenaz originated, the Mנהגי Ashkenaz became diluted as they went east for various reasons. But in Germany, the Chazan always wears a talit, and even the custom is for Ma'ariv, they wear a talit as well. And in the Lithuanian yeshivas, they wear a talit for Mincha, for Ma'ariv. The Shliach Tzibur always wears, because that's the idea of Kovod HaTzibur, respect for the Tzibur. So let me digress for a minute. The question of women having aliyot to the Torah. So the Gemara in Megillah says that in a perfect society, which ours is not, in a perfect society, a woman could have an aliyah. This is quoted by the conservative and reform. This, everybody knows their Gemara, right? If you know which, the one you want, so that everybody's a scholar in that, right? So it says that a woman can also have an aliyah. But it says we don't do so mipnei kovod hatzibur, because of the honor of the tzibur. What's the honor of the tzibur? The honor of the tzibur is that unfortunately men look at women differently than women look at women. And therefore, some people, will make a comment. I knew a woman in New Jersey that was one of the first conservative rabbis. And she retired after a few years, even though she was quite successful. And I once spoke to her, and she said her main frustration is that they were more interested in what she wore than what she had to say. Which is an admission of the reality. So you'll say it's the fault of the men. Yes, it's the fault of the men, but what can we do? That's the way we're wired. And therefore, Kovod HaTzibur has to take that reality into consideration. Because the halacha always deals with what is, not with what should be, not with what we imagine, not what we would like it to be, but with what is. And therefore, that's the problem. So here also, the question of Kovod HaTzibur requires us to wear a talis. So one of the reasons is because of the fact if he wears the talis, you can't see what color suit he's wearing or anything else that would be a distraction. And that's what they call the talis godol, right? A big talis. And wearing the small talis around your neck doesn't accomplish that. So Chazonim used to wear a robe. So the robe is, so to speak, the formal dress. The Chassidim came along and were mevatel that the Shliach Tzibur should have to wear a talis, even for mincha. And the only exception that I found, the Baal HaTanya says you should wear a talis. The Lubavitch said, I don't know whether Lubavitch does it today, because many things that are in the Baal HaTanya are not the custom today in Chabad. But the Baal HaTanya said that they should wear a talis for mincha and for ma'ariv. But it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. There was a custom in Germany that not only the chazan wore a talis, but anyone who said Kaddish also had to wear a talis. Now the original, we're going to talk about Kaddish for a minute, the original rule was that only one person said the Kaddish. We're talking about the mourner's Kaddish. The whole institution of Kaddish is based on a medrash that Rabbi Akiva met a soul that was wandering through the world, and Rabbi Akiva said, well, how can we stop this, and how can we help you? He said, if you get my son to get up in the synagogue and say something and everybody will praise God's name because of that, then I'm redeemed. So the Kaddish is that. Yehei Shmei, everybody answers, Yehei Shmei Rabba Mevorach L'olam L'olmei Omaya, may the great name of God be blessed for all eternity. So then that is the schut. That's the merit of saying the Kaddish. So in many places, in the Lithuanian yeshivas, and in Germany and parts of Lithuania generally, only one person said the Kaddish. And to say the Kaddish meant that you had to walk up next to the chazan, to the Omid, to the place where the services are being led from, and there to recite the Kaddish. And therefore they said you have to wear a talis, because of the fact that that's also Kovod HaTzibur. It's as though you are the partner of the chazan. Also, originally, the recitation of Kaddish was reserved for young children, Rahman al-Islam. In other words, an adult could study for the soul, and that the Schus HaTorah would be for the soul of the departed. Or he could give charity, or he could do other mitzvot, but a young child couldn't do anything. And therefore the Kaddish was instituted originally for young children. But the Kaddish has a life of its own. It took on this great aura, and because of that, the customs changed completely. The custom became that everybody can say the Kaddish, not just one. Even though the rabbi said at least say it in unison, or the rabbi say at least stand together when you say the Kaddish, in order to try and minimize the departure from the original custom. And that is really the way it is today. If a person has an honor for the Torah, to go psicha, to take the Torah out, to go hagbeh, to go glila, to have an aliyah, one has to always wear a talis. Because that's again koved hatzibur. Again, amongst Chassidim that's not true. And they go to an aliyah Shabbos for mincha, for instance, without a talis. But amongst the Lithuanians and the yeshivas, the talis was always necessary. And the rabbi said, it says in the Gemara, Oches Sefer Torah Orum, person that holds a Sefer Torah naked. So it certainly doesn't mean that the person is naked. There are all sorts of interpretations that he touches the parchment. You're supposed to hold the parchment with the talis, not to touch the parchment itself. But one of the interpretations is that he's not wearing a talis, so he's naked. There's no koved Torah, no koved tzibur. From that, there arose other customs in Germany and in other places, and it's brought in the Lahalocha that the rabbi that performs a wedding ceremony should wear a talis. Now, that is not universally observed, but there are rabbis that do it. It certainly makes it more dramatic. The custom amongst the German Jews was that if you got an aliyah, for instance, for mincha, you did not take off the talis immediately when the aliyah was over, but only till after Shmoneh Esrei was over. Because again, that was a sign of respect. And then in Lithuania, there was a custom that the Rabbonim, when they gave a drosha, when they gave a sermon, when they spoke publicly, would wear a talis. So if you speak Shabbos morning, so the Rav always keeps his talis on to speak. But what about the Shabbos Hagodol, Shabbos Shuvah? So again, there was a custom amongst many that the Rav delivered those sermons wearing a talis. Other Rabbonim said that it looked like arrogance on his part. You know, like, yeah. So therefore, there are different customs as to whether or not the talis should be worn while the lecture is being given. As you can see, that's not the case here. Let's go on to a third custom in prayer. At the right before the Amidah, right before Shmoneh Esrei, we have a custom. We say Tzur Yisrael, the custom of the Ashkenazim. Tzur Yisrael, Kuma Be'ezras Yisrael, Ufteichinu Mecha Yehuda v'Yisrael. And then we say a posuk, Go Aleinu Hashem Tzvokos Kadosh Yisrael, and then we make the bracha, Baruch Atah Hashem Goal Yisrael. This last sentence Go Aleinu Hashem Tzvokos Kadosh Yisrael does not appear until about the 14th or 15th century. Doesn't appear in the Rambam, doesn't appear anywhere. And apparently it's a later insertion. The Sfardim, according to the Rambam, don't even say Tzur Yisrael. And therefore, many poskim said that you should not say Go Aleinu Hashem Tzvokos Kadosh Yisrael, because you're adding God's name unnecessarily. And we have no past tradition to rely upon to allow us to do that. Especially since the whole prayer of Tzur Yisrael is an Ashkenazic addition, so to speak. Many of the customs of Ashkenaz are basically the customs of Babylonia, of Bavel. The customs of the Sfardim are more or less the customs of Eretz Yisrael. After the exile, the Jewish people split into two after the Churban Bayis Sheni, so different customs arose because of the disparity of place and of circumstance, etc. And the Ashkenazim claim to have a tradition that goes back to the Babylonian Gaonim, to the yeshivas in Bavel, back to the 8th and 7th centuries. And therefore, that's the basis for most of the Ashkenazic customs. Whereas the Sfardim say that they are fulfilling the customs of the land of Israel, and that's the basis for many of their customs. Now that we are met here together again, the Sfardim and the Ashkenazim, so everybody holds on to their own custom, which is the recommended method in all the works of the rabbis, that people should not give up the custom. Shema b'ni musar avicha, listen to the words of your father, that's the study of Torah. V'al titosh Torah simecha, do not forsake the Torah of your mother. The rabbis say the Torah of your mother is the customs of Israel. So custom plays a very important role. I always mention the quip of Rabbi Yaakov Emden, who we mentioned earlier, that Rabbi Yaakov Emden said that it's too bad, he said, that lo signov is not a custom. If it would be a custom, he said, it would be observed much more, because people are very wary of customs. So anyway, customs are very, very important. And first time that we find this custom of saying Go Aleinu Hashem Tzvokos Kadosh Yisrael are by the French rabbis. And the French rabbis got part of it from the Sephardic custom, and therefore they added Go Aleinu Hashem Tzvokos Kadosh Yisrael. Now, there are Kabbalistic reasons to omit Go Aleinu Hashem Tzvokos. One of the reasons it's mentioned, is that Tzur Yisrael should have only 14 letters, 14 words rather, and should have 60 letters. And the 14 and 60 refer to the 600,000 Jews that were redeemed from Egypt on the 14th of Nisan. And therefore, that's the Goal Yisrael, the redemption of Israel. All our redemptions begin with Egypt, and therefore this is a Kabbalistic reference to the fact that 600,000 Jews were redeemed from Egypt on the 14th of Nisan. Now, if you add Go Aleinu Hashem Tzvokos Kadosh Yisrael, that is destroyed. You don't have 14 words anymore, and you don't have 60 letters, and therefore that whole reason would disappear. There's another reason, probably not correct, but just again to show the mindset. and to explain what once happened in the Jewish world. In 1653, Shabtai Tzvi comes on the scene, and he proclaims himself to be the Messiah. And almost a third of the Jewish people believed it. It was, and then later he bankrupted, he converted to Islam publicly. But even after he did that, Messianists find it very difficult to let go. So even after that, they said, this is the ultimate test whether you really believe. God is testing you. Because if you really believed, you should still believe in that he'll come back now and become the Messiah, even though he converted to Islam. Well, he died a Muslim, and he never came back. After his death, and after this debacle, as you can imagine what it did to the Jewish world, I think that he is the father of many things that happened in the Jewish world in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. To a certain extent, Jews gave up on the Messiah because of him. They looked for different answers. So Reform was an answer, Chassidus was an answer, study was an answer, Zionism is an answer. But until our day, people were very wary to talk about the Messiah. Again, in our day, the envelope has been pushed. Not without consequences. So, it's recorded that those that believed in Shabtai Tzvi when he was still in his heyday, so they would say, Go Aleinu Hashem, comma, Tzvaos, they would say Tzvi Os. Tzvi is the sign of the Geula. Kadosh Yisrael, he is the Holy One of Israel. Baruch Ato Hashem Goal Yisrael. Blessed are you, God, that redeems Israel. You redeem him through Shabtai Tzvi. So in the backlash that happened after Shabtai Tzvi, so therefore, many communities that at one time did say it, now no longer said it. Because of this outside pressure of the Sabbateans, and they didn't want to be able somehow to give a place where they could even say such a thing. So therefore they eliminated it. We're 400 years almost, 350 years from Shabtai Tzvi. He's really not an issue anymore in our world. And it's almost universal today in all the Sidurim that are printed to say, Go Aleinu Hashem Tzvos Kadosh Yisrael. However, again, in certain kehilos that still remain, scattered through the Ashkenazic world, they don't say it. Well, their reasons for not saying are not necessarily clear, but they don't say it. Either because of the violation of the Kabbalistic numerical hint that's involved, or because of the Sabbatean, or because of other, because their father didn't say it, so he doesn't say it either. I'm reminded of the quip of the Ponevezher Rav, who was asked what prayers does he recite on Yom Ha'atzmaut. So he said, I do what Ben Gurion does. I don't say Hallel and I don't say Tachnun. So there are a lot of people that don't say Go Aleinu, right? Also. All right, finally, last one I want to talk about. There's no end to this. You know, there are hundreds and hundreds of customs. But as you see, it's not a narrow topic, because it gives us a background to a lot of things in the Jewish world in an indirect fashion, but we get there. How do we recite the Kedusha in the Shmoneh Esrei? So the original Rabbeinu Saadia Gaon, the Rambam, and others say as follows. The Chazan says Nekadesh or Naritzcha by himself. The audience never says it. The audience only answers Kodosh, Kodosh, Kodosh. And then the Chazan says Lumosom Baruch Yomeru, also by himself. And the audience responds Baruch Kvod Hashem Imkomo. And then the Chazan says Uvedivrei Kodshecha Kosuv Lemor, and the audience responds Yimloch Hashem L'olam. So it is it is not. We don't say the whole Kedusha. The Chazan says some part, and we respond. Right? It's back and forth. And they say that that's the same thing as we see by Kaddish, that the Chazan says Kaddish until Amen, and then the audience responds Yehei Shmei Rabba Mevorach, and you don't say the Kaddish with him. And that was the original custom. It's mentioned in all of the poskim until the 17th century, until the Taz. The Taz Reb David Halevi, the famous Polish commentator to the Shulchan Aruch, one of the great scholars of the Jewish world, an authoritative posek, and he says, I don't know what the problem is to say it. What's wrong with saying it? Ma hezek ba'amiras milos beinaim. What's the problem of saying it? And he said, you'll say the problem is that there are certain things that an individual shouldn't say and certain things that should be said only by the audience. He said, we have a Kedusha that we say before then. The Kedusha in the middle of Yotzer Amoros, right? Mishabchim ve'omrim, right? So and everybody says it. So even if you're davening by yourself, you didn't come to the minyan. That sometimes can happen, even to the greatest of us. And you're davening at home by yourself, you say it. So it's obvious that it can be said by a yochid. It can be said by an individual. And so he said, I don't see what the problem is. And therefore we should say Nekadesh, and therefore we should say with Lumasom Baruch Yomeru, and you can say B'divrei Kodshecha Kosuv Lemor, you can say everything. This, so there were those that tried to make a compromise. The Ari, who was earlier than the Taz, the Ari said, you can say it, but you have to say it with the Chazan. In other words, when the Chazan says, you should say it too. But not that you should say as we do, Nekadesh first, and then the Chazan repeats it, but wait for the Chazan to say, and then you should say it as well. The Marshal, who is really the father of Ashkenazic Psak in many respects, again, early 15th century Lublin, Poland, and is a very, very strong person. It takes no prisoners. The Marshal writes as follows: Kol Rabosai ve'avosai agdoshim, all of my ancestors and my teachers, sheshimshu gonei olam, that they studied under the great scholars of the world, Ra'isi mehem shelo noagu lomar elo kedivrei haTalmud. They only do what the Talmud says. And therefore they only say Kodosh, 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 and that's all they say. V'im hoya, and now he's already talking about the Zohar, which then is getting popular, which indicates that you should say with the chazan, right? Listen to the language he says. Im hoya Reb Shimon ben Yochai omed lefonenu. If Reb Shimon ben Yochai came and stood in front of me, v'tzoveach l'shanos aminig, and he'll holler that we should change our custom of not saying and to say, lo ashgach bey, I wouldn't listen to him. Ki bor dvora vein halacha kamoso, because that's not the halacha. So we're talking about strong people, right? There's nothing to spoil, you say, Reb Shimon ben Yochai. You know, that's not the way we did it. The Aruch HaShulchan says, regarding Lithuanian customs, the Aruch HaShulchan is an interesting sefer, a great sefer, because in it, he, so to speak, says what's right, and then he says what's to do, and they are not necessarily the same, which is a way to understand halacha. Halacha is not the search for the absolute truth, it's a search for the absolute practical behavior. In our time, it's turned on its head. He says, B'chol medinoseinu, in all of Lita, in all of Lithuania, Omri matzibur gamkei nekadesh, vein peido bazeh. Everybody says everything in the right, the way we do. And we don't complain about it. So he says, well, how can we justify the custom? It's wrong, he says. You shouldn't do it, but you should do like the Marshal, you should do like the original poskim. Only the Chazan should say those things. Why should we say it? He says, well, the reason we say it is kulonu mazmini matzmeinu l'kedusha. We have to prepare to say Kodosh. You can't just say Kodosh. Though we seem to do a good job of just saying it. But you have to be prepared. And therefore, by saying Nekadesh, Shimcha Ba'olam, or Naritzach, V'Nagdishach, etc., we, so to speak, prepare ourselves to be able to respond correctly to Kodosh. But he says our custom is, in Lita, they did not say Lumasom Baruch Yomeru, and they didn't say V'divrei Kochecha Kosuv Lemor. Because then he said that's not a preparation for anything. You already prepared yourself. So he says that's like a hefsek. You've interrupted saying, and therefore, and that's the custom in the yeshivas, is that they say in the Kadesh, but they don't say Lumasom Baruch Yomeru, the Chazan says alone. V'divrei Kochecha Kosuv Lemor, the Chazan also says alone. We don't say it with him. The Gaon said, you only say Kodosh, 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 and nothing else. Now here we have another example of the fact that the custom of the Gaon was not necessarily the custom of Lithuania. And many strange customs which exist, even in our neighborhood, are attributed to the Gaon of Vilna. But they're not. They're either Lithuanian customs or Yerushalmi customs. The Gaon had his own way to say it.